What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Tuesday, September 17th edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. And we have another pretty nice-sized MLB slate tonight. I think it's 10 games, but could be 9, could be 11. Pretty sure it's 10. Doesn't look like we have any major weather concerns either, so that's nice. Big tournaments again on DraftKings, 100K to first in the $111, 50K to first in the $8 flagship. So still a lot of baseball money to be made. Hopefully somebody from this show, whether it's you guys or me, can take something down tonight. Last night came somewhat close, but not really. White Sox came through. Detmers sucked. So that was kind of bittersweet because had a lot of Detmers, also did have the White Sox, but didn't get first in anything, so didn't make any money. But going to go right back to it tonight. And we have another core slate. Arizona disappointed yesterday as very heavy chalk. I assume they will be very, very popular again tonight. So going to go through, as usual, looking at the plays that I'd be getting to in large field tournaments tonight on DraftKings if the slate started right now. As a reminder, didn't have all the lineups when I built my lineups and ran through my entire process. So there will be some players that I'm getting to probably that aren't actually playing. If you catch it before I do, just let me know. But for the most part, because of the way stacking works in baseball, you, in a lot of cases, would just end up replacing them with whoever is in the lineup from their respective team anyway. But going to go through position by position, stack by stack, talk about what I'd be getting to. If you have questions about a specific team or player that you like and I, for whatever reason, don't have, feel free to ask because chances are they are a perfectly fine play. It's just a play that I don't have in my lineups. So feel free to ask if you have questions about that. Starting with the pitching. Oh, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button. That helps out a lot. Subscribe to the channel, all of that stuff. There are links in the description below that I'll get into in a little bit as well. But starting with the pitching here, and one thing that stands out immediately is that Griffin Canning is showing up in 56% of my lineups. He's only projected for 15% ownership right now at 6K, taking on the White Sox. I think Griffin Canning is a good play, even though he's not having a very good year. He's facing the White Sox. He's only 6K. I also think he ends up being more popular than is being projected right now. I think that's one reason that he is showing up so much for me. And I noticed even when I created my lineups, he ended up in like 30% of the lineups I built. It's really, really unusual for a player to only be 15% owned if they're showing up if they're showing up in 30% of the lineups that I even build, much less, 50 to 60% of the ones that I'm going to play. So I do think ownership is just low on Griffin Canning right now. I think that comes up. We saw it with Detmers yesterday as well. I don't remember exactly where he came in the $15, but I know he was projected for like 36% ownership. Ended up coming in at 55% in the $111. I expect that we see higher ownership on Canning here. I will be adjusting this after the show. Still looks like a good play, but I did want to point that out that, keep in mind whatever player exposures I'm getting to in my lineups is really just a function of how I'm projecting the players, both as far as their performance and their ownership. And so with an ownership input of only 15%, Griffin Canning shows up a ton. As you increase that number, Griffin Canning is going to show up less frequently, though I still expect that he'll be in plenty of my lineups. It is a good price tag at 6K. He is a pitcher that's had major league success in the past as well. In previous years, he has put up pretty good strikeout numbers. Hasn't been the case this year, but at 6K, you aren't being priced for what he's done in the past. And he does have the excellent matchup going up against the White Sox. So I do think he's a good play. I just wanted to point out the ownership projection here, I think, is just lower than his actual ownership will be. Overall this season, like I said, he has struggled, only striking out 17% of hitters, 4.87 xFIP. I haven't looked to see if I'm getting to White Sox stacks, but I certainly wouldn't mind it. And also, as you increase his ownership projection, it will make White Sox stacks look better as well. But Canning's going to look good one way or the other. Cole Reagan's showing up 42% of the time for me, projected for 30% ownership at 9,800. He has a pretty good matchup going up against Detroit. This game is in Kansas City, which isn't a good park for getting strikeouts, but it's not as big of a deal for somebody like Reagan's because he pitches roughly half of his games here anyway. And so it's pretty much baked into his overall numbers. Detroit's active roster ranks 10th in strikeout percentage against left-handed pitching since the start of last season. They do have a 105 WRC+. Reagan's striking out 29.5% of hitters this year, 3.41 xFIP. Very, very strong pitcher play, as is Zach Wheeler, 28% of the Fields lineups, 37% of mine. He is expensive at 10,500. He does have a dangerous matchup going up against Milwaukee, but also a very talented pitcher. Milwaukee 13th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching on their active roster. They are 13th also in WRC plus at 108. Not a great park to pitch in either. So there is risk for Wheeler, but just a very talented pitcher overall this season, striking out 27.9% of hitters, 3.41 xFIP. Happy to get to him, even with the risk and the elevated salary. Then there's a bit of a drop off for me. Tyler McGill showing up 20% of the time against Washington. Not a very good strikeout matchup, but he does have good strikeout stuff. He's also only 7,700, so he offers some value compared to guys like Reagans and Wheeler. Luis Heel in a good strikeout matchup. I'm right around the field on him, getting 15%. Fields at about 16. This game is in Seattle, which is a very good park for getting strikeouts. The Mariners also strike out a lot on their own, in part because of the park, but also just because that's what they do. They still lead the league in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching on their active roster, even after improving their lineup at the trade deadline. So 8,800 for Heel is a pretty good price tag there. So those are the 5 pitchers I'm getting in double digits. Then it drops off, 7% Frankie Montas, kind of just mixing and matching some other guys. As far as the field goes, Brian Wu getting about 13% ownership. I'm not really getting there. Chris Bassett getting about 12%. I'm not really getting there. I think both of those guys are pretty good pitchers. Wu is at home in Seattle. It is a big park downgrade for the Yankees, but it is still a good Yankees lineup. I don't fault anyone for getting to Wu, but I do prefer the pitchers that I'm getting to. It is a situation, though, where maybe, as I get a little bit less Griffin Canning, once I increase that ownership projection, maybe Brian Wu starts to show up a little bit more. Maybe Bassett starts to show up a little bit more. Not a great strikeout matchup for either guy either. Texas ranks 22nd in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this season. The Yankees rank 21st. Yankees 123 WRC plus on their active roster. Obviously a little bit misleading because it's so heavily driven by Aaron Judge and Juan Soto, who are great, but still they're only at the plate 2 out of every 9 batters. But still a very dangerous Yankees lineup overall. Texas, not as good offensively, but still difficult to strike out. So I don't mind Bassett. I don't mind Wu, but I do prefer the other pitchers that I'm getting to. Jake DeWitt said, how about Lance Lynn? He's getting 11% ownership. I'm at 3%. It's a good matchup against the Pirates. He's another pitcher that probably does pop up a little bit more for me the less Griffin Canning I get. So I think that's probably what's causing me to not get that much Lynn. You can see that I have him projected very similarly to Griffin Canning, and Canning projected for more ownership, but not that much more, at $1,500 less. So it's going to just make Canning a priority over Lynn. But if that ownership actually ends up being like 25 to 30% on Canning, like I think it may be, then Lynn's going to look better because you start to get more of that ownership discount relative to Canning. So I think that Lynn does look good. I think he is somebody that probably got squeezed out of these lineups a little bit because of the artificially low ownership projection on Canning. As that comes up, I do think Lynn starts to show up a bit more. The matchup against the Pirates is pretty good. It's in St. Louis, which is a solid park for pitching. Pittsburgh's 11th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching. Lynn is not a great pitcher, but he's not terrible. 21% strikeout percentage, 4.4 xFIP. I think he looks pretty solid overall. Peyton Tierney beat me to it, but Matt O'Neill said, can you talk about correlation and sim diversity for builds? Generally, I don't know what your question is, but generally the correlation is just going to factor in how heavily it's weighting correlation. And sim diversity is essentially kind of like if you've used Fantasy Cruncher before, optimizers before, it's essentially kind of your randomness. It's basically the lower the sim diversity setting is, the more like the bigger sampling of lineups that it's looking at before it chooses one. So if you set it like all the way to 10, it's just running one simulation and then giving you the lineup that scores the most. If you were to set it at like 2, it's going to run a bunch of simulations and then give you the lineup that scores the best, most often. So generally that's how it works. I personally don't mess with them too much, but in general, stuff like that, advanced stuff as far as, lineup building, process type stuff, Endgame Syndicate is where you want to be. Link is in the description below. I will pull up that site in a little bit too, because I know that people sometimes kind of ask like what's there because the landing page doesn't really give it away. So I will show some of that on the screen, but that is the company, the site that I have with Uticow, Brick75, Nerdy Tenor, where we do talk about a lot of the behind the scenes stuff that we do within our process as far as building lineups, selecting what lineups to play, all of that type stuff, Discord access, videos going through a lot of that stuff. So that's where we talk about a lot of that. I have an entire video out on there showing my MLB process using SaberSim, since that's what I use. So all that stuff is there if you are interested. But as a general answer to how those things work, that's pretty much it. Looking at the stacks that I'm getting to overall, so very spread out again with my stacks, as I would expect on a slate like this. I'm relatively concentrated at pitcher. You have, once again, a lot of offenses that look fine. You don't have a lot of horrible pitching. You don't have a ton of like really good hitters parks or hitters in good matchups in good hitters parks outside, again, of Coors Field, which looks great, but is going to get a lot of ownership. So I expect to be pretty flat offensively, and you're seeing that here. This is all stack types. If you look at 5-mans, once again, Arizona kind of moves down the list because it gets difficult to get to lineups that aren't taking on too much ownership if I'm 5-man stacking them, but they're still, a very highly projected lineup. They're still a team that I want to get to as long as I have contrarian plays elsewhere. So very, very flat offensively. Kansas City, my top 5-man stack right now. Perfectly happy with that. Pretty high implied run total. Good park for offense, even though it's not great for home runs. Bobby Witt Jr. obviously is fantastic. Another 30 fantasy point game last night. Salvador Perez is going to be one of your highest upside catcher options. So those guys driving the stack make sense. And then beyond them, you typically have pretty cheap options as well. So I do like Kansas City. The Yankees showing up second most for me in Seattle. Huge park downgrade for them, like I said, but you do get some negative correlation against Brian Wu as well, and clearly a very high upside lineup. Oakland, Colorado, Philadelphia, the Angels, the Cubs, the Nats, the Yankees, or the Rangers rather, the Mets, the Pirates. These teams just all showing up very, very similarly for me. So again, it's a slate where I think ownership's going to be pretty flat outside of a couple of teams, namely the Diamondbacks. Range of outcomes for most of these teams is pretty similar. So I am once again very spread out, which, as I was saying yesterday, doesn't make for the best content, doesn't make for the best show. It kind of just sounds like you're doing the general, say everybody is good and you'll be right thing. But from a strategy standpoint in tournaments, that is kind of how I'd be approaching offenses here. Obviously, as you saw, I would be taking bigger stands on pitching, but offenses here look very, very similar. And generally my approach, if there are offenses that, like if you have a few offenses that look much better than the field, and one of those offenses just isn't projected to get as much ownership as they should, my strategy in that situation is generally to attack that offense pretty hard. But usually that doesn't end up being the case, especially in 2024 when your opponents are very good. It's very unusual to identify a really good spot and your opponents just miss it. It happens occasionally, but more often than not, the good spots are going to be getting a lot of ownership. And so in a sport like baseball, where there is so much volatility, when you get a slate like this, where a bunch of the offenses look the same, as opposed to just kind of randomly selecting 3 and playing a lot of them, I do generally tend to get more spread out and kind of find ways to get a little bit over the field on a lot of offenses, as opposed to a lot over the field on a few offenses. Obviously, it does, again, vary by what the slate is giving you, what your opponents are likely to do. TTID Forever said, Adam, did you kill it last night? I saw Nerdy won the $15, and when I reviewed this morning, it looked like you had a lot of White Sox. No, I didn't. So I played I prioritized playing the $111 last night. I did have a White Sox lineup in it. It came in 55th or something. It was a good lineup. It had Bobby Witt plus the White Sox, but it was a White Sox stack 1 through 6, skipping over Benintendi. Benintendi hit 2 home runs. I specifically mentioned the lefties being able to hit home runs off Detmers. Still didn't end up in that lineup, so that put me behind most of the White Sox stacks. The White Sox did also actually end up coming in more popular than projected, at least in that tournament. Probably a result of so many people in that tournament using a similar process to me and the White Sox popping up against a very popular Detmers. So that was disappointing as well. But no, I think if I had played large field, it would have probably, I would have had some good lineups, but I also would have had a massive amount of Detmers. So I don't really know how that would have gone. But yeah, the White Sox came through, and I was on the White Sox yesterday. Just still didn't pay me off. Baseball is really hard, but especially, with the top few spots in tournaments having all the money. But if you continually put yourself in that situation, you eventually will get paid, or at least that's how how it's supposed to work. That's what I keep telling myself. So hopefully get it tonight. It was only 50K to first last night. It's 100K tonight. So I'm fine waiting a day. But moving on to catchers here, where I do expect I will be very flat, and I am. I've said it a lot before, but usually at catcher, I'm going to, if I can, be playing somebody from whatever stack I'm getting to. So on slates like this, where I am getting to a lot of different stacks, I'm probably going to have a lot of different catchers. It's just a position that more often than not, I'd like to include in my stack because there's not a lot of good one-off options. I would rather save those for the outfield, for first base, etc., where I can find guys that have legitimate 2 home run and a double upside. There's not many of those guys at catcher. Obviously, it happens once in a while, but there's not many catchers you look at and say, oh, I wouldn't be shocked if this guy hit 2 home runs today. Salvador Perez, Shea Langoliers, Cal Raleigh, Will Smith, Adley Rutschman. That might be the entire list of those guys. So it's a position that I do prefer to correlate with my stack, and that's probably what's happening here for the most part. Hunter Goodman is getting 19% ownership at 3,300. I got to 9%, so he is my highest owned catcher, but I still don't have as much as the field. He is in a good matchup. Jordan Montgomery getting the start for Arizona tonight. He has struggled all season long. The game is in Coors Field. Goodman has the platoon advantage, which is nice. Pulling up the Rockies lineup now because I did want to see what position he's playing. So Hunter Goodman is DHing. That is a slight negative, or not even a slight. That is a negative for him because it makes it very easy for the Rockies to pinch hit for him later in the game. There's no guarantee that they do that. I've said this, in a lot of these shows. When I talk about pinch hit risk, it's not like it's a guarantee because there are a lot of different ways that it can play out. If Colorado just has a really big lead, then they might just leave him in there, let him get some at bats. If there's a variety of other reasons that they could decide to just leave him in there and let him get some at bats. But you do have a right-handed Goodman DHing, which means you don't have any defensive issues with who you replace him with. So any left-handed bat on the bench could very easily pinch hit for him later on in the game. And the only lefties starting today are Ryan McMahon, Michael Toglia, the switch hitter, and Nolan Jones, which means that the Rockies have Jake Cave and Sam Hilliard and Charlie Blackmon from the left side on the bench. Drew Romo, also a switch hitter, but I assume he's not pinch hitting. But you have plenty of left-handed bats that can pinch hit for Goodman. So there is pinch hit risk there. And mostly I mentioned that too, just because he is getting so much ownership. He projects as a very good play from a median outcome standpoint. But there is, the risk that he gets 2-3 at bats, comes out of the game after Montgomery. Cal Raleigh, around 2x the field there going up against Heel. This is one of the catchers that I just like to play when I do need a catcher one-off. Obviously, getting the Cal Raleigh is pretty appealing because he is one of the few catchers, as I mentioned, that has legitimate 2 home run upside. This park does suck for hitting home runs, but it's not as big an issue for him since he does play his home games here. The price naturally bakes in how difficult it is to hit home runs here. So Cal Raleigh, plenty of home run upside here. Does have a tough matchup against Heel. 165 expected ISO to left-handed hitters for Luis Heel. Dylan Dingler not showing up for the field. He's in 7% of my lineups, $2,300. I assume he's probably primarily in Detroit stacks. I would at least hope so. All 11 of the lineups that would have Dylan Dingler have at least one other Tiger. 5 of the 11 have 4 other Tigers. One of them is a 4-man stack. So just in line with what I was saying before, where using correlation to kind of increase the projection of your catcher, since it is a weak position, makes sense. He's not somebody I really want as a one-off because he doesn't give you that type of upside. But if you're stacking the Tigers, that lineup already has the assumption that the Tigers score a lot of runs. And if the Tigers score a lot of runs, all of their hitters' projection just would be higher in that case. And so you may as well use that correlation to drive up the projection at the weakest position to get hitters. Salvador Perez, 7% of my lineups at catcher, might have a little bit more at first base. He's getting 8% ownership here. I think, it's warranted. He is, again, one of the highest upside catchers. It would have been nice if he could have done more than single last night. Facing Casey Mize here. Mize, when he's on, does generally keep the ball on the ground. Doesn't give up a ton of power, but you're just betting on Salvador Perez's talent in this situation. Stephen Leibowitz said Raleigh's home run splits are pretty dramatic. And which splits are you referring to? I assume you're talking about home road, in which case that makes sense. To clarify my point on not caring that Raleigh is at home, I absolutely would prefer Raleigh be on the road because everywhere is better for hitting home runs than Seattle pretty much. But it doesn't – when you get an offense that goes into Seattle or any other very favorable pitcher's park as the road team, they do tend to be naturally overpriced because their price is a function of their performance for the most part over the course of the season. So if you take a guy from like Colorado, not the best example because all those guys suck anyway. But if you take somebody like on the Rockies and then you throw them into Seattle, they're naturally going to be overpriced because their salary is being driven by what they've done over the course of the year, which includes 50% of their games, give or take, being in Coors Field. Whereas Seattle, you have kind of the opposite thing. When they're playing at home, they're priced pretty much where they should be. Like if Cal Raleigh played in a hitter-friendly park, he'd be a 5K catcher instead of a $4,300 catcher. So it's factoring that in. And then when you get a team like Seattle on the road, they tend to naturally be underpriced because their range of outcomes, is more favorable outside of the park that they're priced to play most of their games in. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be taken into account as far as projections go. He would project better if this game were being played somewhere else. But that's what I'm referring to when I say that it's not as much of an issue for him because he plays his home games there. I'm talking from like a pricing standpoint. It is still an issue for him because, playing your home games there doesn't mean you magically just can defy physics and start hitting home runs in Seattle. But it's just baked into his price naturally. Shea Langoliers, same kind of thing. Big time power, also plays his home games in a park where it's tough to hit home runs. He is out of Oakland here in Wrigley Field, so a more neutral park for hitting home runs, which is nice. Just a lot of power though. So just, basically betting on talent there, going up against Jordan Wicks, who's not a bad pitcher, but you just have one of the few catchers that can hit for a lot of power. 166 expected ISO to right-handed hitters this year, 6% projected ownership, pretty much where I'm at as well. But nothing too exciting for me at catcher overall. You can see who I'm getting to the most, but the field is likely to be pretty flat with the exception of Gabby Moreno and Hunter Goodman. I'm not really getting to Moreno. I'm getting to Goodman, but not as much as the field. Gabby Moreno's price is a joke. He's 3,600 in Coors Field. Didn't actually have that Arizona lineup when I ran it. I know somebody said Ketel Marte is out, but I'm pulling it up now just to see how the rest of it looks. Gabby Moreno is also out, so you can ignore this. And that makes me happy because not playing a $3,600 Gabby Moreno in Coors Field is really scary. Not playing a 3K Jose Herrera is, I guess, still kind of scary because it's Coors Field, but it's not as. So no Gabby Moreno in the lineup. Don't play him. And this ownership will get redistributed, obviously. Probably a little bit more going to Goodman, but then also probably just getting kind of spread out to these other guys. Nothing too interesting for me at catcher, though. Nothing that I find very exciting, and it's a position that generally sucks, so I'm not really surprised by that. At first base, pretty flat here as well. We can see that I'm, like I said, just kind of getting over the field on a lot of guys that are low-owned, more so than jamming a few low-owned guys, just getting over the field on a lot of talent here. Bryce Harper in 9% of my lineups at 5,700. Pete Alonso in 9% of my lineups at 4,900. Goes without saying that these are just two very, very high upside first base plays that don't have a lot of ownership. Nice park for power for Harper. Decent matchup against Frankie Montas. He has, been a bit better as the year has gone on. That was expected, just given how his slow start and the type of pitcher that he's been in the past, coming back from injury. But lefties still have a 208 expected ISO overall against him this season, and that makes Harper look good. In addition to Harper just being really good. For Pete Alonso going up against Mitchell Parker, so he's got the platoon advantage. Parker has overall been pretty solid this year. He has allowed a 210 expected ISO to right-handed hitters, only striking them out 19% of the time. Love getting to these guys at low ownership. Going back to my point at catcher and talking about one-offs, where it doesn't surprise anybody if Bryce Harper scores 30 fantasy points or Pete Alonso scores 30 fantasy points. Whereas most of those catchers, if they score more than like 18, you're surprised. So it's just a position where whether it's in a stack or as a one-off, these are guys I want to get to, especially at low ownership. Spencer Torkelson, 3,700, decent price tag for him. Good park for offense, even though it's not great for home runs. Don't mind getting to him at a pretty cheap salary. It's not a good matchup against Reagans. Reagans also does have reverse splits. He has one of the best changeups in baseball. So it's a bad matchup for Torkelson, no question. But getting to some Tiger stacks against Reagans makes sense. I would assume Torkelson is probably pretty heavily skewed toward all Tiger stacks. So again, I don't really want a lot of one-offs. Ideally, I don't want a lot of one-offs against somebody like Cole Reagans. He doesn't give up a ton of power. It's not a great park for hitting home runs. The idea with the Tigers is basically, and if you're talking about like Milwaukee against Wheeler or other teams against good pitchers, the idea is more so if that pitcher happens to struggle, you want to just maximize the number of bats that you have against them and maximize the amount of negative correlation you have with the field. So for the most part, a team like the Tigers, I want to be either not playing them or playing them in stacks because it's just really unlikely that, like, it can obviously happen, but it's unlikely that somebody like Torkelson just hits 2 home runs and then, other than that, the Tigers don't do anything. If I'm going to one-offs, I want guys in better matchups that are more likely to have success. But where I am getting Torkelson, I may as well just be getting to all the Tigers, hope that Cole Reagans has one of his worst starts of the year, and then I'm just completely capitalizing on that. So, that's a difference between Harper and Alonso. I don't know how much these guys are in stacks. Still, obviously, if you're stacking the Phillies, Harper's good. Same for Alonso with the Mets, goes without saying. But in other stacks, still getting to these guys makes more sense than getting to somebody like Torkelson. Luken Baker here batting second at 3,200. His salary has finally come up, pretty much in line with the field there. Still a good lineup spot, still offers value. Not a great park for hitting home runs, so nothing I want to get too carried away with. He does have a pretty good matchup against Bailey Falter. Falter can be pretty frustrating to take hitters against because when he's on, he locates well and doesn't get lit up. But overall this year, 193 expected ISO, 17% strikeout percentage. Yuli Gurriel, not a ton of power, but he is 2,400, batting sixth. Christian Walker is batting cleanup at 5,900. I am about half the field there, 5 to 6%, fields at 12. He is at least priced correctly, so that keeps his ownership in check, as opposed to some of these other guys on the Diamondbacks that are completely mispriced. Walker is, of course, one of the best hitters on this team. If you can get to him, by all means, get to him. Feltner's not a terrible pitcher, but this is still a game in Coors Field, and taking your chances on the Diamondbacks looks very good, ownership considerations aside. Feltner allowing a 162 expected ISO to righties this year. Colia a little below the field, a little over on Lowe, a little under on Vaughn. So again, pretty flat there, but Bryce Harper, Pete Alonso standing out for me as very, very good tournament plays. So I do like that. At second base, Marcus Semien at the top for me, about 2x the field there, going up against Bassett. So you do get some negative correlation for him. You're in a park that plays up power. The negative is that Chris Bassett has been lights out against right-handed hitters this year. Sub 100 expected ISO, 26% strikeout percentage. The matchup is not good for Semien, but he does still have upside. He has some power. He has the ability to steal bases. He's in a home run friendly park. Bassett has ownership. And so getting the Semien here does make some sense, whether it's as a one-off or in stacks. I don't have a huge preference there. It is in Texas stacks exclusively. So, that does make it a little bit better. But he is somebody where even if he were a one-off, I wouldn't have minded. I was getting about half the field on Ketel Marte. He's not in the lineup, so we can ignore that one. Arizona's lineup, obviously just looks weaker here. No Moreno, no Marte. So not as appealing as from just a projection standpoint as it looked when I ran these lineups, but it does still obviously look good overall. Carroll, Perdomo hitting second, so you get some value there at shortstop. Peterson, Walker, a cheap Pavin Smith, McCarthy, Suarez, and then you have Yorme and Herrera at the bottom of the order, who are very, very cheap, but also not particularly exciting hitters. So they're still going to look good. They're just not going to be as good and probably a little bit less popular than they were projected when I initially ran these lineups. Bryson Stott, over the field on him against Montas. Again, I do like that quite a bit. Just getting these Phillies at low ownership against a pitcher in Montas that has given up power to lefties this year, and the Phillies obviously have a lot of it. This park plays it up as well. You have Schwarber in the lineup, Harper, Stott all from the left side. Brandon Marsh is affordable from the left side. And then there's nothing wrong with getting to Turner, Castellanos, Real Muto. They obviously give you a nice ceiling, but I do like getting these left-handed bats quite a bit, especially just considering the lack of ownership that they're getting in this park in a perfectly decent matchup. The Brewers do have 3 left-handed relievers in their bullpen, which is unfortunate. One of them threw 22 pitches yesterday, so I don't know if Hobie Milner will be available, but neither of Jared Koenig or Aaron Ashby pitched yesterday. So I do assume that those guys are going to be available today. So they can match up, but Schwarber and Harper both hit left-handed pitching really well anyway. So it's not a huge concern for me. I just would prefer if those guys didn't exist, but it's not the end of the world that they're out there. Gleyber Torres, 2x the field there. Like I said, I was getting to some Yankees against Brian Wu. The park sucks. The matchup isn't good. It's basically just betting on low-owned talent. I've said it in this show. I was talking about it yesterday. When you get these slates that are very, very spread out, where one team or two teams project much better than everybody else, and the rest of the teams pretty much project about the same, I really like taking advantage of low ownership on talented players, talented offenses, just because if you have a median, like a bunch of teams or players having similar median projections, doesn't tell you the whole story. Median projections aren't created equally. And the way people make lineups, less so now than a couple years ago when everybody was using optimizers instead of sims. But still, the way people tend to make lineups and prioritize things is that they do treat median projections a little bit more like they're more important than they are without factoring in range of outcomes. You can have two players with a very similar median projection, but the guy that hits home runs, strikes out, and steals bases is going to have more volatility, a bigger standard deviation, and a higher ceiling than the guy that hits a bunch of singles, doesn't steal bases. So, but they can have very similar median projections. And so, a team like the Yankees, the park sucks, the matchup sucks, but when they do well, it looks like a lot of home runs, a lot of extra base hits. You can have a team that has a similar implied run total and doesn't have anywhere near the talent. When they do well, it's a bunch of singles and doubles falling in, not that many home runs, and not as many fantasy points. So teams like the Yankees, the Dodgers, the Dodgers are tough for me to get to usually for other reasons, but teams like that have big time power throughout their lineup when they're low owned. If their median projections are similar to other teams, assuming that the salaries are relatively easy to get to, they are the teams that you should prefer just because the range of outcomes is more favorable. Gleyber Torres certainly fits that at 4K. Will Wagner is not in the lineup. He's actually out for the rest of the season. That came out right before I started the show, so won't be getting to him. Iglesias, Donovan, Rogers, all relatively affordable. Rogers is getting a lot of ownership. He's projected to be one of the highest owned second basemen. Obviously, Ketel Marte not going to get any ownership, but Brandon Drury, if he's in the lineup, once again projected to be popular as a cleanup hitter at 2,600. Brendan Rodgers looks good going up against Jordan Montgomery, batting cleanup in Coors Field. Very, very good point per dollar play. It's just an ownership thing why I'm not getting to him, but he obviously looks like one of your best second base plays. I'm not getting to much Nicky Lopez either. He's projected for 8% ownership leading off. Good price point, but Nicky Lopez also just the kind of guy that when he's popular, I am fine going elsewhere. He doesn't offer a ton of volatility. He is pretty unlikely to put up a game that you have to have. So he does have a decent matchup here against Canning. It is a good park, but if he's going to be relatively popular, I'm okay not getting as much of him. I may also just have him at shortstop. I'm not sure. Before we move over to third base, I did want to just quickly show the Endgame Syndicate site, as I said that I was going to, because I know people have kind of asked what is actually over there. And so an Endgame Syndicate subscription, which the link is in the description below, gets you access to the site. It gets you access to our Discord where we all hang out. We have a lot of really advanced subscribers as well. So a lot of good conversations over there. I've definitely learned a lot being in there. But we have a bunch of DFS training, instructional, whatever you want to call it, videos for basically intermediate and advanced strategy from Unical, Brick, Nerdy, and myself, just talking through different things. Every month, we also have a members-only roundtable, which some of you have probably seen on YouTube. We usually start it out in front of the paywall and then move it behind. That's where we take member questions about DFS and answer them, talk about whatever people have questions about. But here, Nerdy Tenor has a whole series out using toy games for best ball. Toy games are basically smaller versions of the bigger game, smaller versions so you can actually solve them and then apply what you learned to your strategy for bigger games. So he has a whole series doing that for best ball, which obviously NBA best ball going on now, NFL, pretty much just wrapped up. Nerdy Tenor has other series using toy games for DFS stuff, how you can approach DFS contests, different types of DFS contests, how your strategy should change if your opponents are going to do different things, stuff like that, that you can really hone in on and learn from smaller versions of games. Brian, Brick75, has a video out on how he uses ownership. Obviously, that's something the industry talks about a lot. This guy's high owned, this guy's low owned, whatever. That doesn't actually do you any good building lineups. You need to have a way to actually be factoring it into the lineups that you play. He talks about how he has done that. We have Yuta has gone through some of his winning lineups, talking about the things that he looked at. Here, Yuta and I both went through our entire MLB lineup building process and then compared basically where we got to at the end. We have very similar processes. We still ended up in very similar places, which I think is a good thing, and it kind of speaks to that you can attack DFS from very different angles. So we walked through that, compared notes on that one. Brick has talked about how he uses contest sims. Like I said, I went through and showed my entire MLB process, which involves using SaberSim because that's what I use. But obviously, not everybody myself included, is capable of building their own tools and all of that. So I talked about how I approach using publicly available stuff and getting it to still do what I want in a way that is unique to me. Utical talks about things in MLB that he thinks industry projections don't account for, that he factors in, that he likes to look at, that he thinks gives him an edge. More game theory, toy games from Nerdy. Brick talks about how to create your own projections and ownership projections. So that kind of stuff is on the site in video form. And then again, we have the Discord where we're in there whenever to answer whatever questions, strategy questions, whatever it may be you guys have. So I'm excited about it. We obviously have more stuff coming there as well, but wanted to actually show the site since I know if you go to the landing page, you can't really see a whole lot, and people do tend to ask about that. Now moving over to third base, Brandon Drury, again, getting ownership here. I'm not getting to him if he is in. If he's not in, then obviously nobody's getting to him. One thing I did want to point out here with the Angels matchup against Davis Martin is that I do think it's still a perfectly fine spot for the Angels. They're in a good hitter's park. Davis Martin probably isn't a great pitcher. Davis Martin did add a changeup a handful of starts ago. He basically stole it from Hayden Birdsong on the Giants. The Davis Martin's coach's personal pitching coach, whatever it was, noticed that he had a lot of similarities in his mechanics to what Hayden Birdsong does. And Hayden Birdsong has a very good changeup. So they basically just stole Hayden Birdsong's grip, and Davis Martin started just throwing it out of nowhere. It's been an effective pitch for him. His numbers have been pretty good since he started throwing it. So I do think Davis Martin naturally just goes a little bit under projected. And as a result, his opponents go a little bit over projected. So that is something to keep in mind. Again, it's a data point. It is still a spot where the Angels are in, a pretty good spot. The White Sox don't have a good bullpen. The park's good for offense, all of that. But I did want to point out that in addition to the ownership that is coming into some of these Angels, it may not be, or it probably isn't quite as good a matchup as projections are making it out to be, because Davis Martin seems to have added a plus pitch that didn't exist until like a month or a month and a half ago. So just something to keep in mind. Not really getting the Suarez here, only getting half the field on Arenado. No real issues with that. Clearly, if I were getting the Suarez, that would be cool. But the matchup against Feltner's not great. He is priced up, so he's one of the Diamondbacks that did get a price bump for playing in Coors Field, which means that his salary is just going to be a little bit more efficient. Nolan Arenado, getting half the field against Falter. It is a good matchup. It's not a great park for hitting home runs. I think there's just other third basemen that look similar enough from a range of outcome standpoint, but Arenado is a pretty good value at 3,900. Getting to Bregman, the field's not really there at all. Getting to Machado on the other side of the game, the field's not really there at all either. Again, just sort of betting on talent, even if it's not the best spot. Manny Machado, tough matchup against Hunter Brown. He's only allowed a 101 expected ISO to righties this year, but Manny Machado is really, really good. Same thing for Alex Bregman. Michael King, only a 135 expected ISO allowed to righties this year, but Bregman also really, really good. So if my opponents just aren't going to play some of the best hitting third basemen, and they're all going to flock to Eugenio Suarez and Brandon Drury and whoever else, Nolan Arenado, I'll take my chances, at 1/10 to 1/15th the ownership on guys like Bregman and Machado. No issues with that. Andy Ibanez leading off does offer value at 2,500. Not playing in much at first base, but I am getting to him some at third as a value play. Again, somebody that I would prefer to be in Detroit stacks as opposed to being a one-off. He is that didn't select. I was going to say he's only in 10%. That wouldn't be good. Of my 15 Ibanez lineups, 14 of them have another Tiger. 4 of them are 5-mans. Another one's a 4-man. So using him in some mini stacks with Tigers and some full stacks, but not too often as a one-off, which, again, is ideal. Mark Vientos, 2x the field on him against Parker. I like this one. It's just another good range of outcome spot. The most likely case is that Parker has a decent game. He's a solid pitcher. The park's not great for hitting home runs, but when he's not on top of his game, guys like Pete Alonso, Mark Vientos have the power to really, really do damage at low ownership. So those are the types of guys that I like getting to. Isaac Paredes, same kind of thing. So pretty spread out at third base, but I am taking some nice stands on Bregman, Machado, Mark Vientos, and I'm happy with all of those. At shortstop, I assume Perdomo is going to get a lot of ownership, especially since he is hitting second with no Marte. I'm getting to Dansby Swanson the most. He had a huge game yesterday. I did not have him in my Cub stack. That was kind of the theme of the slate for me yesterday was I stacked teams that did well and then happened to not have the guy that did the most damage. But looks like I'm getting him today going up against Mitch Spence. Perfectly fine matchup. Swanson's fairly priced at 4,200. Has some power upside, has some stolen base upside. 169 expected ISO to righties for Spence. So like I was saying before, not a ton of spots on this slate where the pitcher is terrible. You have a lot of just kind of average-ish pitchers, Spence being one of them, but Swanson does give you talent at a relatively weak position for that price tag. Again, shortstop, I've said it a lot on some slates. It's a loaded position. On other slates, it's less so. No Gunnar Henderson on this slate. No Ellie De La Cruz on this slate. Mookie Betts isn't a shortstop anymore, I don't think, at least. So Corey Seager's out for the year. So not the same loaded position that we've seen other times. Makes it a little bit easier to get to guys like Swanson. Jacob Wilson showing up for me as well. He's batting 6th today, so he did move down in the order. He ended up being pretty chalky yesterday, but that probably does come down a bit with him batting 6th instead of leadoff. Does still have the platoon advantage against Wicks. Does put the ball in play. Not a ton of power upside, but putting the ball in play at 2,400 does have its merits. Most guys in that price range just have no above average hitting quality. Wilson does at least do that well. Bobby Witt Jr. goes without saying. Whatever you can get to is going to look good. Casey Mize doesn't give up a lot of power, like I said, but Bobby Witt Jr. is just so good at everything on a baseball field that getting him is still going to look pretty appealing. Josh Smith, a bit over the field going up against Bassett. I do like this one. I mentioned when I talked about Semien that Bassett's been very good against right-handed hitters this year. Not the case against lefties, only striking them out 20% of the time. 213 expected ISO, 381 expected WOBA in a park that plays up power. Josh Smith not getting ownership. Chris Bassett getting a little bit of ownership. I like getting to Josh Smith quite a bit. He is sitting second. Tovar, popular. If you can get to him in lineups that make sense, obviously it looks good. CJ Abrams at basically no ownership. Don't know if we've gotten a Nats lineup yet. We didn't have it earlier, probably because we're waiting on his status. But if he is in, I do like getting to him at low ownership against McGill. He is likely hitting further down the order than you would like. So it's kind of an overpay to be contrarian spot. His median projection isn't going to look great. You would prefer him at the top of the order, but that's probably not going to be the case. But he does still have power and stolen base upside against a relatively popular pitcher at very little ownership. So if he's in, I like that in tournaments. May not be in which case, obviously, ignore him. Zach Neto, Kiner Falefa, both sort of whatever. The field is projected to get to Tovar and Witt the most, followed by Perdomo. I do think you'll see Perdomo's ownership come up now. He is hitting second instead of ninth, but also no Ketel Marte and no Gabby Moreno means less places where people are going to allocate their Diamondbacks exposure. People aren't going to play Herrera a lot, I wouldn't think. They're not going to play Guillorme a lot, I wouldn't think. So you kind of have 7 Diamondbacks now just pulling all of their ownership instead of 9. So that will condense it more and will probably drive it up on Perdomo, in addition to him batting second. I would guess he ends up coming in at like 15 to 20% now instead of the 9% that he's projected for here. And then finally, rounding things out in the outfield, Corbin Carroll, Pavin Smith, Jock Peterson, all expected to be the most popular outfielders. They all should be, but it is still a lot of ownership that you have to navigate. I'm getting to Carroll and Peterson more than I'm getting to Smith. He does have first base eligibility as well, but all of these guys are very obviously good plays. It's just a matter of making it work within your lineups. Hunter Goodman getting ownership here as well. I'm not getting to him much. I am getting to him more at catcher, but still under the field overall. Definitely prefer playing him at catcher if I can, for all the reasons I said before. The opportunity cost is just lower. If you play Hunter Goodman in the outfield, you then also need to play a catcher. Whereas if you play him a catcher, you get to play an outfielder instead. Obviously, that is more favorable. For me, Carroll is my highest owned outfielder. Then we're getting some Yordan Alvarez and Fernando Tatis on opposite sides of that game. Again, two good pitchers in that game. It drives down the median projection for guys like Alvarez, Tatis, Machado, Bregman, but it doesn't do anything to the fact that they're still really, really, really good hitters with a ton of home run upside. In Tatis's case, stolen base upside as well. So it just goes back to the whole median projection conversation where, they don't project very good for their salary, but when they do well, it looks very different than when some guy that projects similarly from a median standpoint because they have a better matchup does well because they get 2 singles and a double. When Alvarez does well, it involves home runs. When Tatis does well, it involves home runs and stolen bases. So getting to those guys at low ownership on a slate like this where there's not clear-cut, really good second and third options that are lower owned than the Diamondbacks makes a lot of sense to me, and I'm happy to see it. Same goes for Juan Soto, not projected for any ownership. Dalton Varsho not in the lineup, so we can ignore that one just like we ignored Will Wagner. Seiya Suzuki, Benintendi coming off the 2 home run game yesterday, Tyrone Taylor showing up a bit. Those are basically just relatively low-owned value plays. But I do like what I'm doing up here in the outfield, maximizing upside at low ownership, getting to Alvarez, Tatis, Soto. Obviously, you could throw Aaron Judge in there as the same type of play as well. So I am happy to see that. And that wraps up this slate. Again, just a very wide open slate as far as offenses go for me. I think that a lot of them look very similar. I think the biggest thing is just trying to attack as much upside as you can, take advantage of volatility, attack the guys that actually hit home runs, not just the guys that are good point per dollar median projections, especially when you can get those home run guys at low ownership. Pitching wise, I do think Canning's ownership projection is too low. I think he comes in 25, 30% as opposed to 15. That will probably lower how much I have of him. It will probably drive up how much I'm getting for the White Sox a little bit, but he is still a very good value in this spot at 6K. Reagans, Wheeler are the priorities for me as far as payoff options. McGill, he'll look fine. I'm not really getting to Brian Wu against the Yankees, but if you want to in Seattle, that's perfectly fine. I'm not really getting to Lynn against Pittsburgh, but again, I think that looks perfectly fine. If anybody has last minute questions, you can throw those in chat. Otherwise, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, use the links in the description below, sign up for Endgame Syndicate. Like I was saying, I think it's a great way to get better, ultimately save yourself some money in the long run by being able to do things for yourself that right now maybe you're paying other people for you. At worst, learn how to maximize the things that you're already paying for. If you don't play enough volume, that makes sense. You can get access just to my content using the link for that. That includes game by game notes for all of the Sunday main slate NFL games, access to my NFL projections, optimal percentages, how often players show up in different stacks, all of that stuff, and my Discord also. So sign up using those links, whatever makes the most sense to you. Good luck on your lineups tonight, and I'll see you back here again tomorrow.